Barren Desert Virtue. Isabel Bell Carter had never played a hand she couldn't win until Cass McGraw slid a deck of cards toward her, his smirk slow and wicked. He leaned in, fingers grazing hers. "You got two choices, sugar," he murmured. "Fold or go all in with me." Chapter 1. The Devil's Deal at Dusk. The setting sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, painting the weathered storefronts in hues of blood orange and fading rose. Isabel Bell Carter stood on the warped wooden porch of the Golden Nugget Saloon, the establishment she'd painstakingly built from a ramshackle gambling den into the town's beating, albeit slightly tarnished, heart. Her fingers, calloused from years of dealing cards and handling rough-hewn men, tightened around the worn railing. The air, usually thick with the scent of cheap whiskey and stale tobacco, carried a different kind of tension tonight, a crackling anticipation that prickled her skin. Belle wasn't a woman easily rattled. At 57, her life had been a tapestry woven with threads of grit and grace, loss and resilience. She'd buried a husband, a good man but a weak one, swallowed by the unforgiving desert 20 years prior. She'd raised a daughter, fiercely independent, and now married off to a rancher in a neighboring territory, leaving Belle with an echoing emptiness she filled with the clatter of chips and the murmur of late-night poker games. Her auburn hair, streaked with silver that caught the dying light like spun gold, was pulled back in a severe bun, accentuating the sharp angles of her face, the determined set of her jaw. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky after a rare desert rain, held a weariness that belied her inner strength. Tonight, however, that strength felt frayed. The arrival of Cass McGraw had done that. He'd ridden into town 3 days ago, a phantom on a coal-black stallion, his presence as disruptive as a sudden dust storm. He was a man built for trouble, all lean muscle and hard angles, with eyes the color of polished obsidian that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed defenses. His smile, when it appeared, was a slow, dangerous curve of his lips, hinting at secrets and a past as wild and untamed as the land itself. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that bordered on arrogance, a gambler's swagger that both irritated and, she was loath to admit, intrigued her. He'd been watching her, Belle knew. Not in a leering, disrespectful way that she was used to deflecting with a sharp word or a colder stare. No, McGraw's gaze was different. It was assessing, like he was weighing her, measuring her worth, calculating the odds. And that made her uneasy. She'd learned long ago that men who looked at you like that were usually looking for something, and what they were looking for often came at a price. The saloon doors swung open, spilling a cacophony of noise and laughter onto the porch. A group of rowdy cowboys, fueled by whiskey and the promise of a winning hand, stumbled out, their boisterous voices momentarily drowning out the low hum of the crickets that were beginning to chirp their evening song. Belle watched them go, her gaze lingering on the empty doorway. McGraw was still inside. He'd been playing poker all evening, a silent, watchful presence at the high-stakes table, his winnings steadily growing. He played with a cold, calculated precision that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. She took a deep breath, the scent of sage and dust filling her lungs. The air was cooling rapidly, the desert's fickle nature mirroring the turmoil in her own heart. She'd built this life, brick by brick, hand by hand. She wouldn't let some smooth-talking gambler dismantle it. But the memory of his words from earlier that evening, whispered across the crowded saloon floor, sent a shiver down her spine. He'd approached her as she was collecting the house's cut from a particularly lucrative pot, his voice low and rough, a stark contrast to the raucous atmosphere around them. "You're a hard woman to read, Belle Carter," he'd said, his breath warm against her ear. "But I'm a patient man, and I always get what I'm after." She'd met his gaze then, her own unwavering, refusing to show the tremor of unease that his words had sparked. "And what is it you're after, Mr. McGraw?" He'd smiled then, that slow, dangerous smile that made her heart beat a little faster. "A game, Mrs. Carter. A game with stakes higher than any you've ever played." Now, as the last rays of sunlight faded and the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, She knew that game was about to begin. The saloon doors opened again, and this time it was him. Cass McGraw stepped onto the porch, his silhouette framed by the warm glow of the saloon's interior. He moved with a predator's grace, his boots silent on the wooden planks. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough for her to catch the scent of him: leather, gunpowder, and something else, something wilder and more primal that sent a strange, unfamiliar heat curling through her. He held a deck of cards in his hand, fanning them out with a practiced flick of his wrist. The cards whispered in the quiet evening air, a sound that seemed to echo the unspoken challenge in his eyes. "Evening, Belle," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very timbers of the porch. "Care for a game?" Belle looked at him, at the cards, at the vast, star-studded expanse of the sky above. She knew this was a turning point, a moment where her carefully constructed life could either be solidified or shattered. She thought of her daughter, of the quiet evenings spent on this very porch, of the years of struggle and sacrifice. She thought of the emptiness that had been her constant companion, the loneliness she'd learned to accept as the price of her independence. And then, she thought of the spark in McGraw's eyes, the dangerous allure of the unknown, the faint, almost imperceptible flicker of something that might, just might, be hope. He leaned in, his proximity stealing the air from her lungs. The cards seemed to shimmer in the fading light, their faces blurring into a kaleidoscope of possibilities. His fingers, calloused and strong, brushed against hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her. "You got two choices, sugar," he murmured, his voice a silken whisper that wrapped around her like a velvet rope. "Fold, or go all in with me." The weight of his words, the intensity of his gaze, the sheer, undeniable force of his presence, pressed down on her. Belle Carter, the woman who had never backed down from a challenge, the woman who had built an empire on her wits and her nerve, felt a tremor of fear, a flicker of doubt. But beneath that fear, something else stirred. A long dormant ember of something she thought she'd buried long ago. A yearning, a desire, a reckless, foolish, undeniable hope. She met his gaze, her own steady, her voice surprisingly calm despite the storm raging within her. "And what are the stakes, Mr. McGraw?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications, with the promise of a future she couldn't yet imagine, a future that could either break her or make her whole. A future that was now, irrevocably, tied to this dangerous, captivating man and the game he was about to draw her into. Chapter 2. Echoes of a Renegade Past. Cass McGraw didn't answer immediately. He simply held her gaze, those obsidian eyes of his seeming to bore into her very soul. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote, a mournful sound that echoed the loneliness Belle had carried within her for so long. He slowly shuffled the deck, the cards whispering secrets between his calloused fingers. It was a deliberate act, designed to heighten the tension, to draw her deeper into his web. Belle knew the tricks of gamblers, she'd used them herself countless times. But knowing them didn't make her immune to their power, especially when wielded by a man like McGraw. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. "The stakes, Mrs. Carter," he said, his gaze never leaving hers, "are everything." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Your saloon, your reputation, your future." He leaned closer, his breath warm on her cheek, the scent of him that intoxicating blend of leather, gunpowder, and something wilder filling her senses. "And mine." Belle's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that belied her outward calm. She'd faced down drunken brawls, armed robberies, and the constant threat of ruin in this unforgiving land. She'd learned to be hard, to be ruthless, to survive. But this was different. This was a gamble on a scale she'd never contemplated, a wager that could strip her bare, leaving her with nothing but the dust and the memories. "And what makes you think I'd risk everything on a game with you, McGraw?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady, a testament to years of masking her true emotions. He smiled then, that slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver of both apprehension and something else, something akin to excitement, down her spine. "Because, Sugar," he said, his voice a silken whisper, "you're a gambler at heart. And gamblers, they can't resist a high-stakes game, especially when the prize is worth more than gold." He was right, of course. She was a gambler. It was in her blood, a legacy from her father, a charming rogue who taught her everything she knew about cards, about reading people, about winning and losing. He'd also taught her about the allure of risk, the intoxicating thrill of putting everything on the line. It was a lesson she'd both embraced and cursed, a double-edged sword that had both built her empire and left her vulnerable. She looked at the cards in his hand, their faces still blurred, their secrets yet to be revealed. She thought of the golden nugget, of the years of sweat and toil she'd poured into it. It was more than just a saloon, it was her sanctuary, her fortress, her identity. To risk it all, it was madness. But there was something in McGraw's eyes, something beyond the swagger and the challenge, something that hinted at a deeper vulnerability, a hidden pain that resonated with her own. She saw a flicker of loneliness there, a shadow of regret, a yearning for something more. It was a fleeting glimpse, barely perceptible, but it was enough. "Tell me about your past, McGraw," she said, the word surprising even herself. She hadn't intended to ask, hadn't planned on revealing any interest beyond the game itself. But something in his presence, in the way he held himself, in the way he looked at her, compelled her to probe deeper, to uncover the man beneath the mask. He raised an eyebrow, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "My past?" he repeated, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge. "That's a story for another time, Mrs. Carter. Tonight, we're playing cards." "I play with people I trust," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "And I don't trust a man who hides behind secrets." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he let out a low chuckle, a sound that held both amusement and a hint of respect. "Fair enough, Belle. Fair enough." He leaned back against the railing, the wood creaking under his weight. The stars were brighter now, a million diamonds scattered across the vast, velvet canvas of the night sky. He looked out at the darkness, his gaze distant, as if he were searching for something lost in the shadows. "I was born in a nowhere town, much like this one," he began, his voice losing some of its hard edge, taking on a softer, more melancholic tone. "My father was a prospector, always chasing the next big strike, always dreaming of riches that never materialized. My mother, she died when I was young. I don't remember much about her, just the scent of lavender and the sound of her singing." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I learned to play cards before I learned to read. It was a way to survive, a way to make a few coins in a world that offered little else. I got good at it. Too good, maybe." He glanced at her, a flicker of self-deprecating humor in his eyes. "I won my first saloon in a poker game when I was 17. Lost it a week later in a knife fight. That's been the pattern of my life, Belle. Wins and losses. Highs and lows. A constant gamble." He told her about his travels, about the dusty trails and the boom towns, about the fortunes won and lost, about the men he'd met, the friends he'd made, and the enemies he'd earned. He spoke of a life lived on the edge, a life of constant risk and uncertainty, a life that had both hardened him and left him yearning for something more. He spoke of a woman, a brief, passionate affair that had ended in betrayal and heartbreak, leaving him with a deep-seated mistrust of love and commitment. He spoke of a brother, a younger sibling he'd sworn to protect, but had ultimately failed, a failure that haunted him still. He didn't offer excuses, didn't ask for pity. He simply told his story, laying bare the scars of his past, the wounds that had shaped him into the man he was today. And as Belle listened, she began to understand him, to see beyond the gambler's facade, to glimpse the vulnerable, wounded soul beneath. She realized that his offer, his challenge, wasn't just about the saloon, about winning or losing. It was about something deeper, something more profound. It was about connection, about trust, about the possibility of redemption. It was a gamble, yes, but it was a gamble on her ability to see him, to accept him, to offer him a chance at something he thought he'd lost forever. The wind picked up, swirling dust around them, a miniature tornado that mirrored the turmoil in her heart. She looked at him, at the lines etched around his eyes, at the weariness that belied his youthful strength, at the flicker of hope that had replaced the challenge in his gaze. And she knew that she couldn't fold. She had to play. She had to go all in. Not just for the saloon, not just for her future, but for the chance, however slim, to find something she hadn't realized she was searching for. A connection, a purpose, a love that could heal the wounds of the past and offer a new beginning. The first step was a leap of faith, as precarious and dangerous as any hand she had ever played. The question was not what she was willing to risk, but what she could do with the winnings. Chapter 3. Shadows on the Sunlit Mesa. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the desert air crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the heat of the previous night's encounter. Belle awoke with a sense of both trepidation and anticipation. The memory of McGraw's words, his story, his offer, hung in the air like the lingering scent of gunpowder. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying the conversation, analyzing every word, every gesture, every flicker of emotion in his eyes. She rose, dressed in her usual attire, a practical, dark skirt and a crisp white shirtwaist, her only concession to vanity a silver concho belt that had belonged to her mother. She braided her hair, the silver strands catching the sunlight streaming through the window of her small room above the saloon. As she looked in the mirror, she saw a reflection of a woman who was both strong and vulnerable, a woman who had weathered countless storms and was now facing another, perhaps the most challenging of her life. She went downstairs, the saloon still and silent in the early morning light. The remnants of the previous night's revelry, overturned chairs, scattered cards, the lingering smell of stale beer and tobacco were a stark reminder of the life she'd built, the life she was now risking. She began to tidy up, her movements automatic, her mind elsewhere. She thought about her daughter, Sarah, and the letter she'd received from her just a few weeks ago. Sarah was expecting her first child, and Belle longed to be there, to share in her joy, to offer her support. But the journey was long and arduous, and the saloon demanded her constant attention. Now, with McGraw's arrival and the impending gamble, the possibility of seeing her daughter seemed even more remote. The thought fueled a surge of anger, a resentment towards McGraw for disrupting her carefully ordered life, for forcing her to confront the choices she'd made, the sacrifices she'd endured. But beneath the anger, there was also a flicker of something else, a grudging admiration for his audacity, his honesty, his willingness to lay bare his soul. She was sweeping the floor near the poker table where McGraw had sat the previous night when she noticed something glinting in the sunlight. She bent down and picked it up. It was a small, intricately carved wooden wolf, no bigger than her thumb. It was exquisitely detailed, its eyes tiny chips of obsidian that seemed to follow her movements. She recognized it immediately. McGraw had been fiddling with it during their conversation, his fingers absently caressing its smooth surface. She held it in her palm, feeling the warmth of the wood, the smoothness of the carving. It was a tangible link to him, a reminder of his presence, his vulnerability, his story. She wondered why he'd left it behind. Was it a deliberate act, a subtle message, a token of his intentions? Or was it simply an oversight, a careless mistake? She tucked the wolf into her pocket, a sudden, inexplicable urge to keep it close, to protect it, to understand it. The saloon doors opened, and Belle looked up, expecting to see McGraw. Instead, it was Sheriff Brody, a tall, gaunt man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much of the harsh realities of frontier life. He was a good man, honest and fair, but he also carried a weight of sadness, a weariness that mirrored Belle's own. "Morning, Belle," he said, his voice gruff but kind. He removed his hat, revealing a thinning patch of gray hair. "Quiet morning." So far. Chapter 4. A bargain struck in blood and tears. "So far," Belle echoed, placing the broom against the wall. She gestured towards a table. "Coffee's fresh, Sheriff. Help yourself." Brody nodded his thanks and poured himself a cup, the dark liquid steaming in the cool morning air. He took a slow sip, his gaze sweeping the saloon, taking in the remnants of the previous night's activities. He and Belle had a comfortable understanding, a silent respect forged over years of shared hardships and the unspoken loneliness of their respective positions. Heard McGraw was in town, Brody said, his voice low, his eyes meeting Belle's. Belle nodded, her expression guarded.
He was. He's trouble, Belle.
You know that, right? I know he's a gambler, she replied, her voice carefully neutral. And I know how to handle gamblers. Brody sighed, running a hand over his tired face. This ain't just about cards, Belle. McGraw, he's got a reputation. A dark one. He's been linked to some unsavory characters, some dangerous dealings. Belle knew the sheriff was speaking the truth. She'd heard the whispers herself, the rumors that had followed McGraw into town like a shadow. But she'd also seen something else in him, something that Brody, for all his wisdom and experience, hadn't seen. Or perhaps hadn't wanted to see. He told me his story, she said quietly, her fingers instinctively reaching for the wooden wolf in her pocket. Brody raised an eyebrow, his gaze questioning. His story? Belle hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She didn't want to betray McGraw's confidence, but she also trusted Brody, valued his judgment. He's had a hard life, Sheriff, she said finally. He's made mistakes, yes. But he's also searching for something. And what's that, Belle? Redemption? Brody's voice was laced with skepticism, but there was also a hint of understanding, a flicker of empathy in his eyes. Belle met his gaze, her own unwavering. Maybe. Or maybe just a chance. A chance to start over. A chance to be something other than what his past has made him. Brody studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he took another sip of his coffee, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken thoughts and concerns. He wants to play, Belle said, breaking the silence. He wants to play for the golden nugget. Brody's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't seem surprised. And you're going to let him?
Belle's jaw tightened.
I haven't decided yet. It was a lie, of course. She had decided. She just hadn't admitted it to herself, hadn't fully accepted the implications of her decision. Belle, Brody began, his voice filled with concern. Don't let him fool you. He's a smooth talker, a charmer. He'll use your kindness against you. I'm not a fool, Sheriff, Belle retorted, her voice sharper than she intended. I know the risks. Brody held her gaze, his eyes searching, probing. Do you, Belle? Do you really? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken warnings, with the weight of Brody's own experiences, his own losses. Belle looked away, unable to meet his gaze, unable to deny the truth in his words. The saloon doors opened again, and this time, it was McGraw. He stood framed in the doorway, his presence filling the room, his shadows stretching across the floor towards Belle. He was dressed in a dark shirt and pants, his gun belt slung low on his hips, the silver buckle gleaming in the sunlight. His eyes, those intense obsidian eyes, met Belle's across the room, and she felt a jolt of something fear, excitement, anticipation run through her. He nodded to Brody, a curt, respectful gesture. Sheriff. Brody returned the nod, his expression wary, his hand instinctively moving towards the gun at his hip. McGraw. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent standoff between two men, two different worlds, two opposing forces. Belle stood between them, caught in the crossfire, her heart pounding in her chest. McGraw's gaze shifted back to Belle, his expression softening slightly. Morning, Belle, he said, his voice low and smooth, a stark contrast to the tension in the air. Ready to play? Belle took a deep breath, steeling herself. She met his gaze, her own unwavering, her voice surprisingly calm. I am, she said. But not here. And not for the saloon. McGraw raised an eyebrow, a hint of surprise and then amusement, flickering in his eyes. Oh. And where would you prefer, Mrs. Carter? And for what stakes? Belle walked towards him, her steps deliberate, her gaze never leaving his. She stopped a few feet from him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to see the faint scar that ran along his jawline, a reminder of his violent past. "We'll play at my ranch," she said, her voice low and steady. "The one my husband left me. It's a few hours' ride from here, out on the mesa." McGraw's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze searching, questioning. "And the stakes?" Belle reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden wolf, holding it up between them. The sunlight glinted off its obsidian eyes, making it seem almost alive. "This," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And a promise." McGraw looked at the wolf, then back at Belle, his expression unreadable. "A promise?" he repeated, his voice laced with curiosity. "A promise," Belle confirmed, her gaze unwavering, "that if you win, you'll leave Redemption Creek. You'll leave me and my saloon and this town alone. You'll disappear, and you'll never come back." McGraw's smile was slow and dangerous. "And if you win, Belle, what do I get?" Belle's heart pounded in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She knew this was the moment of truth, the point of no return. She was risking everything, not just her livelihood, but her heart, her soul, her future. "If I win," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but filled with a newfound resolve, "you'll stay. You'll stay and you'll help me. You'll help me run the ranch, protect it from those who would try to take it from me." It wasn't the whole truth. There were dangers she could not yet articulate, threats that even Brody did not know of. Threats that only a man like McGraw, a man with his dark past and dangerous skills, could face. The ranch was more than just land and cattle. It represented a desperate, last-ditch plan, hatched in secret, to secure a future for Sarah and her unborn child. A future that was now, irrevocably, tied to the outcome of this gamble. The unspoken bargain was sealed. He would either be her salvation or her ruin. Chapter 5. The Whispers of Redemption Creek. The ride to Belle's ranch was a journey through a landscape that mirrored the turmoil in her heart. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the earth and turning the air shimmering with heat. The silence between Belle and McGraw was thick with unspoken tension, punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of their horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Belle led the way, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She knew this land intimately, every rise and fall, every twist and turn. She'd ridden these trails countless times with her late husband, Thomas, their dreams of building a life together as vast and boundless as the open sky above. But those dreams had died with Thomas, swallowed by the unforgiving desert, leaving Belle with nothing but a legacy of hard work and a gnawing emptiness. She glanced back at McGraw, who rode a few paces behind her, his presence a constant, unsettling reminder of the gamble she'd made. He sat tall in the saddle, his body moving with the rhythm of his horse, his eyes scanning the landscape with a vigilance that spoke of a life lived on the edge. He looked every bit the outlaw, the renegade, the dangerous man that the rumors painted him to be. But Belle had seen something more in him, something that defied the easy labels, the simple judgments. She'd seen a vulnerability, a weariness, a yearning for something beyond the violence and the chaos that had defined his life. And she'd made a choice, a reckless, foolish choice, to trust that flicker of humanity, to believe in the possibility of redemption. As they rode, Belle found herself stealing glances at him, studying his profile, the hard lines of his face, the way his dark hair curled at the nape of his neck, the way his hands, calloused and strong, held the reins with a gentle firmness. She wondered about the woman he'd spoken of, the one who had betrayed him, the one who had left him with a deep-seated mistrust of love. She wondered if he was capable of loving again, of trusting again, of opening his heart to the possibility of something real, something lasting. The thought sent a shiver of something unfamiliar, something akin to longing, through her. It was a dangerous thought, a foolish thought, a thought she quickly dismissed. She couldn't afford to be distracted, to be swayed by emotions. She had to focus on the game, on the stakes, on the future she was fighting for. They reached the ranch in the late afternoon, the sun beginning to dip towards the western horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple and gold. The ranch house, a modest adobe structure with a wide, shaded porch, sat nestled in a small valley, surrounded by rolling hills and acres of grazing land. It wasn't grand, but it was home, a sanctuary Belle had fiercely protected for 20 years. As they dismounted, Belle felt a sense of both relief and trepidation. This was where it would happen, where her fate would be decided, where her life would either be shattered or transformed. McGraw looked around, his eyes taking in the scene, his expression unreadable. "It's peaceful," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, a hint of surprise in his tone. Belle nodded, her gaze sweeping the familiar landscape. "It is," she agreed. "Or it used to be." She didn't elaborate, didn't explain the threats that loomed, the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic setting. She didn't want to reveal her hand, not yet. She needed to keep him guessing, to keep him off balance, to maintain some semblance of control in this precarious situation. They unsaddled their horses, letting them graze in the nearby corral. Belle led McGraw to the porch, where a weathered wooden table and 2 chairs sat waiting. She gestured for him to sit, and he did, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. Belle went inside, returning a few moments later with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. She poured them each a drink, the amber liquid glinting in the fading sunlight. She handed him a glass, their fingers brushing, sending a jolt of electricity through her. "To the game," she said, raising her glass, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. McGraw met her gaze, his own intense, his lips curving into a slow, knowing smile. "To the game," he echoed, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. They drank, the whiskey burning a trail down their throats, a fiery counterpoint to the cool evening air. Belle set her glass down, reaching for the deck of cards she'd brought with her. She shuffled them, her movements practiced, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. "5-card draw," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "No limits." McGraw nodded, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Sounds fair." The game began. The cards whispered between their fingers, the only sound in the stillness of the evening. The stakes were high, the tension palpable, the future uncertain. As the cards were dealt and the bets were placed, Belle found herself drawn into the rhythm of the game, her mind focused, her senses heightened. She watched McGraw, studying his every move, every expression, trying to read his tells, to anticipate his strategy. He was good, she had to admit. Better than she'd expected. He played with a cold, calculated precision, his emotions masked, his intentions hidden. But Belle was good too. She'd learned from the best, honed her skills over years of practice, years of survival. She knew how to bluff, how to deceive, how to win. As the game progressed, the sun sank below the horizon, casting long shadows across the porch. The stars began to appear, their faint light illuminating the faces of the 2 gamblers, their expressions locked in a silent battle of wills. The only sounds were the whisper of the cards, the occasional sigh or grunt, and the distant howl of a coyote, a mournful sound that echoed the loneliness and the desperation of the moment. Belle knew, with a growing certainty, that this game was about more than just the ranch, more than just a promise. It was about their lives, their souls, their very futures. The whispers of Redemption Creek, the rumors and the judgments, seemed far away. Here, on the quiet mesa, it was just the 2 of them, their pasts and the cards. It was a prelude, a quiet before a storm, a whispered prayer before a plunge into the unknown. Chapter 6. Scars Beneath the Starlight. The game stretched on, hours melting into the night. The pile of chips in the center of the table grew, representing not just money, but years of toil, dreams, and fears. Belle found herself increasingly drawn to McGraw, not just as an opponent, but as a man. The flickering lamplight illuminated his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the intensity of his gaze, the faint lines of weariness around his eyes. She noticed the way his fingers, calloused and strong, handled the cards with a surprising delicacy, The way his jaw tightened when he was bluffing, the subtle flicker of his eyes when he held a winning hand. She saw the scars, both physical and emotional, that marked him, the reminders of a life lived on the edge, a life of violence and loss. And she felt a growing empathy for him, a connection that transcended the game, the gamble, the stakes. During a lull in the play, as Belle shuffled the deck, McGraw leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping the vast, star-studded expanse of a night sky. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice surprisingly soft, a hint of awe in his tone. Belle followed his gaze, her own heart aching with the beauty of the scene. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of diamonds, a million stars twinkling in the darkness. It was a sight that always filled her with a sense of peace, a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the insignificance of her own troubles. "It is," she agreed, her voice barely a whisper. "My husband, Thomas, used to say that the stars were the souls of those who had passed on, watching over us." McGraw nodded, his gaze still fixed on the sky. "Maybe he was right," he said. "Maybe they are." He was silent for a moment, then he turned to Belle, his eyes searching hers. "You loved him very much, didn't you?" Belle's heart clenched at the question, the memory of Thomas, his gentle smile, his unwavering love, his tragic death, flooding her senses. "I did," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He was a good man, a kind man. And you've been alone ever since?" McGraw asked, his voice low, his gaze probing. Belle hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She'd learned to guard her heart, to protect her vulnerability, to keep her emotions hidden. But there was something in McGraw's eyes, something that compelled her to be honest, to open up, to share her pain. "Yes," she said quietly. "I've been alone." "It's a hard life, being alone," McGraw said, his voice filled with a knowing sadness. "Especially in a place like this." Belle nodded, her gaze meeting his. "It is," she agreed. "But I've learned to manage. I've learned to be strong." "Strength isn't always enough, Belle," McGraw said, his voice gentle, his eyes filled with a surprising tenderness. Sometimes we need someone. Someone to share the burden, someone to lean on, someone to love." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken longing, with the possibility of something more, something that both terrified and intrigued her. Belle looked away, unable to meet his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't need anyone," she said, her voice a little too sharp, a little too defensive. McGraw didn't reply. He simply reached across the table and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. His fingers, calloused and strong, enclosed hers, their warmth a stark contrast to the coolness of the night air. Belle didn't pull away. She allowed herself to feel the connection, the comfort, the spark. It was a dangerous feeling, a foolish feeling, a feeling she knew she shouldn't indulge. But she couldn't help herself. She was drawn to him, to his strength, his vulnerability, his honesty. He turned her hand over, his thumb gently tracing the lines on her palm, the scars that marked her own life, her own struggles, her own losses. "You have scars too, Belle," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Scars that run deep." Belle's breath caught in her throat. She felt exposed, vulnerable, seen in a way she hadn't been in years. She looked at him, at his eyes, those intense obsidian eyes that seemed to see right through her defenses, right through her mask of strength, right to the core of her being. And, in that moment, something shifted. Something broke. The walls she'd built around her heart, the defenses she'd erected over years of loneliness and loss, began to crumble. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, a hot, salty trail of emotion that she couldn't control, couldn't hide. McGraw gently wiped the tear away with his thumb, his touch sending a shiver of something akin to hope through her. "It's okay, Belle," he said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with compassion. "It's okay to feel. It's okay to need." His words were a balm to her wounded soul, a release she hadn't realized she needed. She leaned into his touch, allowing herself to be vulnerable, to be comforted, to be seen. The cards lay forgotten on the table, the gamble momentarily suspended, replaced by a deeper, more profound connection. The scars beneath the starlight, both hers and his, were laid bare, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon and the shared understanding of two souls who had known both loss and the enduring, if fragile, hope for something more. The night held its breath, waiting. Chapter 7. The Price of a Gambler's Heart. The moment of shared vulnerability hung between them, fragile and precious. Belle felt a connection with McGraw that she hadn't experienced with anyone since Thomas's death. It was a connection forged not on shared joy or easy laughter, but on shared pain, shared loss, shared understanding of the harsh realities of life and the enduring need for human connection. McGraw's hand still held hers, his touch gentle and reassuring. He didn't speak, didn't try to break the silence, didn't try to rush the moment. He simply allowed her to feel, to grieve, to be. Finally, Belle pulled herself together, wiping away the remnants of her tears, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. She felt a strange mixture of embarrassment and gratitude, of vulnerability and strength. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I don't usually lose control like that." McGraw smiled, a gentle, understanding smile that reached his eyes. "There's no need to apologize, Belle," he said. "We all have our breaking points." He released her hand, and Belle felt a pang of regret, a sense of loss at the breaking of the physical connection. She quickly gathered herself, reminding herself of the game, of the stakes, of the future that hung in the balance. "We should finish the game," she said, her voice regaining its usual composure. McGraw nodded, his expression serious. "We should." They resumed playing, but the atmosphere had shifted. The tension was still there, but it was tempered by a newfound understanding, a respect, a connection. Belle found herself less focused on winning, less concerned with the saloon, and more interested in McGraw himself, in the man behind the gambler's mask. As the game neared its end, Belle realized she was going to lose. McGraw's hand was simply too strong, his play too calculated, his luck too inevitable. She knew she should fold, cut her losses, salvage what she could. But she couldn't. She couldn't give up, not yet. She had to see it through, to the bitter end. The final hand was dealt. Belle looked at her cards, her heart sinking. She had nothing, a collection of mismatched cards that offered no hope of victory. McGraw, on the other hand, had a full house, aces over kings. A winning hand, an unbeatable hand. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of triumph and regret. He knew he'd won. She knew he'd won. The game was over. "I believe I win, Belle," he said quietly, his voice devoid of gloating, his expression surprisingly somber. Belle nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She met his gaze, her own unwavering, her voice surprisingly calm. "You do," she agreed. She reached across the table and placed her cards face down, a gesture of surrender, of acceptance. The saloon, her livelihood, her future, was now his. She'd lost everything. But as she looked at McGraw, at his face, at his eyes, she realized she hadn't lost everything. She'd gained something too, something she hadn't expected, something she hadn't even realized she was searching for. She'd gained a connection, a friendship, a possibility. McGraw didn't reach for the chips, didn't gloat over his victory. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. "The saloon is yours, McGraw," Belle said, her voice barely a whisper. "You won it fair and square." McGraw shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't want the saloon, Belle," he said, his voice low and rough. Belle's heart skipped a beat. She looked at him, confused, disbelieving. What do you mean?" McGraw leaned forward, his gaze intense, his voice filled with a sincerity that she couldn't doubt. "I meant what I said earlier," he said. "I don't want the golden nugget. I want something else." Belle's breath caught in her throat. She knew what he was going to say, knew what he was offering, knew what he was asking. And she knew, with a certainty that surprised even herself, what her answer would be. "I want you, Belle," McGraw said, his voice a husky whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "I want to stay." I want to help you. I want to be with you. He reached across the table and took her hand again, his touch sending a wave of warmth through her. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability, a longing, a love that mirrored her own. Belle looked at him, at his face, at his eyes, and she saw not the outlaw, not the gambler, not the dangerous man, but the kind, compassionate, wounded soul that he truly was. And she knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that transcended fear, that transcended everything she'd ever known, that she loved him too. "And I want you, Cass McGraw," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but filled with a newfound strength, a newfound hope, a newfound love. "I want you to stay." The price of a gambler's heart, she realized, wasn't money or property or power. It was something far more valuable, far more precious, far more real. It was love, trust, connection, the willingness to be vulnerable, to take a chance, to open your heart to the possibility of something more. And that, Belle knew, was a price worth paying. The cards lay scattered, forgotten, the remnants of a game that had changed their lives forever. The starlight illuminated their faces, reflecting the dawn of a new beginning, a new hope, a new love, forged in the crucible of a gamble and won, not with cards, but with hearts. Outside, on the vast and silent mesa, the faint hint of dawn began to color the eastern sky. Chapter 8. Betrayal in the Blazing Sun. The days following their agreement settled into a rhythm that was both comforting and unsettling for Belle. Comforting because she had McGraw by her side, his presence a constant source of strength and support. Unsettling because she knew the peace they'd found was fragile, threatened by the shadows of McGraw's past and the dangers that lurked closer to home than she cared to admit. McGraw proved to be a surprisingly adept ranch hand. He was strong and capable, handling the horses, mending fences, and tending to the cattle with an ease that belied his years as a gambler. He was also a quick learner, picking up the nuances of ranch life with an eagerness that both surprised and pleased Belle. But it wasn't just his physical strength that impressed her. It was his quiet confidence, his unwavering dedication, his willingness to work alongside her, to share the burdens, to be her partner. He didn't try to take over, didn't try to dominate, didn't try to change her. He simply helped. They worked together, side by side, their days filled with the hard, physical labor of ranch life. They shared meals, simple fare cooked over an open fire, their conversations ranging from the mundane to the profound. They talked about their pasts, their dreams, their fears, their hopes. They learned about each other, layer by layer, peeling back the defenses, revealing the vulnerabilities, forging a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. Belle found herself falling deeper in love with him, her heart swelling with a tenderness, a passion, a joy she hadn't felt in years. She loved his quiet strength, his dry wit, his gentle touch, his intense gaze. She loved the way he made her feel safe, protected, cherished. But there were also moments of doubt, moments of fear, moments when the shadows of his past seemed to loom large, threatening to engulf them both. She saw the flashes of darkness in his eyes, the moments when he withdrew into himself, the haunted look that spoke of a life lived on the edge, a life of violence and loss. She knew he was still hiding things from her, secrets he wasn't ready to share, wounds that hadn't fully healed. And she knew, with a growing sense of dread, that those secrets, those wounds, would eventually come to light, threatening to destroy the fragile peace they'd found. One sweltering afternoon, as they were repairing a section of broken fence, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching the ranch at a rapid pace. Belle recognized him immediately. Jed, one of the hands from the neighboring ranch, owned by Bart Winslow, a man Belle had known and distrusted for years. Winslow was a powerful, ruthless man with a reputation for getting what he wanted by any means necessary. He'd been eyeing Belle's ranch for years, coveting her land, her water rights, her cattle. He'd made several offers to buy her out, offers she'd always refused, knowing that he would never pay a fair price, knowing that he would eventually try to take it from her by force. Jed reined in his horse, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and urgency. "Belle," he said, his voice breathless, "you gotta come quick. There's trouble." Belle's heart clenched with dread. She knew, instinctively, that this was the trouble she'd been fearing, the threat she'd been anticipating. "What kind of trouble, Jed?" she asked, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "It's Winslow," Jed said. He's claiming your north pasture. Says it's his. Says he's got papers to prove it." Belle's blood ran cold. The north pasture was the most valuable part of her ranch, the source of her best grazing land, her most reliable water supply. If she lost it, she'd be ruined. "He's lying," she said, her voice tight with anger. "I have the deed. It's been in my family for generations." "I know, Belle," Jed said. "But he's got men with him. Armed men. And he's threatening to take it by force." Belle looked at McGraw, her eyes searching his. She saw the concern in his gaze, the readiness, the resolve. "Let's go," McGraw said, his voice low and firm, his hand instinctively moving towards the gun at his hip. They saddled their horses and rode towards the north pasture, their hearts pounding in their chests, their minds racing with possibilities, with fears, with plans. As they rode, Belle explained the situation to McGraw, filling him in on Winslow's history, his ruthlessness, his determination to take her ranch. "He's been after my land for years," she said. "He's tried everything: legal challenges, intimidation, even violence." McGraw nodded, his expression grim. "We'll stop him, Belle," he said. "I promise you." They reached the north pasture, and Belle's heart sank. Winslow was there, along with a dozen of his men, all armed and mounted. They were in the process of driving Belle's cattle off the land, herding them towards Winslow's property. Winslow saw them approaching and smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile that sent a chill down Belle's spine. He was a large, burly man, with a weathered face and cold, calculating eyes. He exuded power, arrogance, and a complete disregard for the law. Well, Winslow said, his voice booming across the pasture. "Look who's here. The widow Carter. And her gambler." Belle ignored the insult, her gaze fixed on Winslow, her voice steady and firm. "This is my land, Winslow," she said. "Get your men and your cattle off my property." Winslow laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Not anymore, widow," he said. "I have the deed. Right here." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, waving it in the air. Belle knew it was a forgery, a blatant lie, a desperate attempt to steal her land. But she also knew that Winslow had the power, the influence, the connections to make it stick. "That's a fake," Belle said, her voice trembling slightly, but filled with defiance. "I have the real deed. It's been in my family for generations." "Prove it," Winslow challenged, his smile widening. "Prove it in court. If you can." He knew she couldn't. He knew he had her trapped. He had the men, the guns, the power. McGraw stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his gun, his eyes narrowed, his voice low and dangerous. "Get off her land, Winslow," he said. "Now." Winslow turned his attention to McGraw, his eyes filled with contempt. "And who's gonna make me gambler?" he sneered. "You?" "I am," McGraw said, his voice as cold as steel. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, a silent standoff between two men, two wills, two forces. Belle stood between them, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She knew this was the moment of truth, the point of no return. A fight was coming, a battle she couldn't win on her own. Suddenly, a voice rang out, a voice Belle recognized, a voice she hadn't expected to hear. "Winslow." Sheriff Brody rode into the pasture, his horse at a gallop, his face grim, his eyes blazing with anger. He was accompanied by two of his deputies, both armed and ready. Winslow's smile faltered, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. He hadn't expected Brody to interfere, hadn't anticipated his intervention. "Sheriff," Winslow said, his voice losing some of its confidence. "What's the meaning of this?" You know damn well what the meaning of this is, Winslow, Brody said, his voice harsh and unforgiving. You're trespassing. You're harassing a law-abiding citizen. And you're threatening violence. I have the deed, Winslow protested, holding up the forged document. This land is mine. That deed is a fake, Winslow, Brody said. And you know it. I've seen the real deed. It's in Belle Carter's name. And it's been in her family for generations. Winslow's face turned red with anger, his fists clenching. You're taking her side, Brody? He snarled. You're betraying me? Brody's gaze was unwavering, his voice filled with authority. I'm upholding the law, Winslow, he said. And the law says this land belongs to Belle Carter. He turned to his deputies. Arrest him, he ordered. And his men. Winslow's men hesitated, looking at their boss, unsure what to do. Winslow himself seemed stunned, momentarily speechless. He hadn't expected Brody to stand up to him, to challenge his authority, to betray him. But then, a flicker of something dark, something sinister, crossed Winslow's face. He smiled, a slow, cruel smile that sent a shiver of dread down Belle's spine. You think you've won, Brody? Winslow said, his voice low and menacing. You think you've saved her? You haven't. You've just made things worse. He nodded to one of his men, a particularly vicious-looking individual with a scar across his face. The man drew his gun, aiming it not at Brody, not at the deputies, but at Belle. Everything happened in a blur. McGraw saw the movement, reacted instantly, instinctively. He pushed Belle out of the way, shielding her with his body, just as the shot rang out. The bullet struck McGraw in the shoulder, the force of the impact spinning him around. He staggered, his face contorted in pain, but he didn't fall. He drew his own gun, firing back at Winslow's man, hitting him in the chest. The man crumpled to the ground, dead. The other men, seeing their comrade fall, seeing McGraw's deadly accuracy, surrendered, dropping their weapons. Brody and his deputies quickly disarmed them, securing the scene. Belle rushed to McGraw's side, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes filled with terror.
Cass,
she cried, her voice trembling. Are you all right? McGraw was leaning against his horse, his face pale, his shirt stained with blood. He managed a weak smile, his eyes filled with pain, but also with love. I'm okay, he said, his voice strained. Just a scratch. It was more than a scratch. The bullet had torn through his flesh, leaving a gaping wound. Belle knew he was in serious pain, knew he needed medical attention immediately. But she also knew that he was alive, that he'd saved her life, that he'd kept his promise. The betrayal had come, not from him, but from the blazing sun of Winslow's greed, and it had cost them dearly. The price, however, was not yet fully paid. Chapter 9. Crossroads of Courage and Fear. Belle, with Jed's help, managed to get McGraw back to the ranch house. The ride was agonizing, every jolt sending waves of pain through McGraw's injured shoulder. Belle rode beside him, her hand constantly on his arm, offering what comfort she could, her heart a knot of fear and worry. They laid him on the bed in her room, the same bed where they had shared quiet conversations, stolen glances, and the burgeoning promise of a future together. Now, that future seemed precarious, threatened by the violence that had erupted in the sun-drenched pasture. Belle quickly assessed the wound. The bullet had gone clean through, thankfully, but he'd lost a lot of blood, and the risk of infection was high. She needed to clean the wound, stop the bleeding, and bandage it properly. She also needed to get him to a doctor, but Redemption Creek was hours away, and she didn't know if he could survive the journey in his condition. She worked quickly and efficiently, her hands surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her heart. She'd tended to wounds before, the inevitable result of living in a harsh and unforgiving land. She'd stitched up cuts, set broken bones, and even delivered a baby once. But this was different. This was McGraw. This was the man she loved. She stripped off his blood-soaked shirt, revealing the hard muscles of his chest and the network of scars that crisscrossed his back, each one a testament to a life lived on the edge. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, the sharp sting causing McGraw to grit his teeth in pain, but he didn't cry out. She packed the wound with clean cloths, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. She then bandaged it tightly, securing it with strips of cloth torn from a clean sheet. As she worked, she talked to him, her voice low and soothing, trying to keep him conscious, trying to reassure him, trying to reassure herself. She told him about her childhood, about her dreams, about her love for him. She told him about her daughter, Sarah, and the grandchild she was expecting. She told him about the future she envisioned, a future where they would be together, a future where they would build a life, a family, a home. McGraw listened, his eyes fixed on her face, his expression filled with a mixture of pain, gratitude, and love. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers gently caressing her cheek. "Belle," he whispered, his voice weak but filled with emotion. He didn't finish the sentence, his eyes closing, his body going limp. Belle's heart leaped into her throat. She felt for his pulse, her fingers trembling. It was there, weak and thready, but still there. He'd passed out from the pain and the blood loss. Belle sat beside him, holding his hand, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't know what to do. She was alone, miles from help, with the man she loved bleeding and unconscious. She felt a surge of despair, a sense of helplessness, a fear that threatened to consume her. But then, she remembered something. Something her father, the gambler, had taught her long ago. "When the odds are stacked against you, Belle," he'd said, "you have two choices. You can fold or you can bluff. And sometimes the best bluff is the truth." She looked at McGraw, at his pale face, at his still form, and she knew what she had to do. She had to bluff. She had to play the hand she'd been dealt, even if it seemed like a losing one. She stood up, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let him die. She would fight for him, just as he'd fought for her. She went outside, saddled her horse, and rode. She rode towards Winslow's ranch, towards the man who had tried to kill her, the man who had shot McGraw, the man who held the key to her survival. She rode with a purpose, a determination, a fury that burned away her fear. She had a plan, a desperate gamble, a bluff that could either save them both or destroy them completely. She reached Winslow's ranch, the sun setting behind her, casting long shadows across the land. She dismounted, her hand resting on the gun at her hip. She walked towards the main house, her steps deliberate, her gaze unwavering. She found Winslow on the porch, drinking whiskey and celebrating his victory with his men. He looked up, surprised to see her, his expression a mixture of arrogance and curiosity. Well, he said, his voice slurred with alcohol. "Look who's back. The widow Carter. Come to beg for your land back." Belle ignored the insult, her gaze fixed on Winslow, her voice cold and steady. "McGraw's dying," she said. "He needs a doctor. And you're going to get him one." Winslow laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Why would I do that?" He sneered. "He's your problem, not mine." "He's your problem too, Winslow," Belle said, her voice low and menacing. "Because if he dies, I'm going to tell everyone what happened. I'm going to tell them that you tried to kill me, that you shot McGraw, that you forged that deed." Winslow's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. "You can't prove any of that," he said. "It's your word against mine." "It's not just my word," Belle said, her voice filled with a confidence she didn't quite feel. "There were witnesses. Jed. And others." She was bluffing, of course. There were no other witnesses. But Winslow didn't know that. "And," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I have something else. Something that will ruin you. Something that will expose your secrets." She was referring to the rumors she'd heard about Winslow, the whispers of his illegal dealings, his corrupt connections, his dark past. She didn't know the specifics, but she knew enough to make him sweat. Winslow's face paled slightly, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. He knew she was bluffing, but he couldn't be sure. He couldn't risk her exposing him, couldn't risk losing everything. What do you want?" he asked, his voice losing some of its arrogance. "I want you to send for Dr. Miller in Redemption Creek," Belle said. "I want him here, at my ranch, by sunrise. And I want you to stay away from me, from McGraw, and from my land. Forever. Winslow hesitated, his mind clearly racing, weighing his options. He could refuse, call her bluff, and risk everything. Or he could comply, save himself and lose. The crossroads stretched out before him, marked by courage and fear, by Belle's fierce determination and his own crumbling facade of power. The setting sun cast a blood-red glow on the scene, a stark reminder of the violence that had already occurred and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Chapter 10. The Outlaw's Gentle Touch. Winslow stared at Belle, his eyes narrowed, his mind clearly calculating the odds. He was a gambler himself, in his own way, always looking for an angle, an advantage, a way to win. But this time, he knew he was outmatched. Belle's bluff, however desperate, had hit its mark. He couldn't risk her exposing his secrets, couldn't risk losing his power, his influence, his empire. "All right, widow," he said finally, his voice grudging, his expression defeated. "You win. I'll send for the doctor." Belle didn't show any sign of relief, didn't let her guard down. She knew Winslow was a dangerous man, a man who wouldn't hesitate to betray her again if he saw an opportunity. "And you'll stay away from my ranch," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "From me and from McGraw. Forever." Winslow nodded, his eyes filled with resentment, but also with a grudging respect.
"You have my word," he said.
Belle didn't trust his word, but she had no other choice. She had to take him at his word for now. She had to focus on getting McGraw the medical attention he needed. She turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high. She didn't look back, didn't give Winslow the satisfaction of seeing her fear, her vulnerability. She rode back to her ranch, the night air cool against her face, the stars twinkling above her like a million tiny beacons of hope. She prayed that the doctor would arrive in time, that McGraw would survive, that they would have a future together. She reached the ranch house, her heart pounding in her chest. She rushed inside, finding McGraw still unconscious, his breathing shallow, his skin pale. She sat beside him, holding his hand, her eyes filled with tears. "Please, Cass," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Please don't leave me.
Please stay with me."
She waited, the hours stretching on like an eternity. The night was filled with the sounds of crickets chirping, owls hooting, and the distant howl of a coyote, a mournful sound that echoed her own despair. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, she heard the sound of horses approaching. She looked up, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. It was Dr. Miller, a kindly, older man with a weathered face and gentle hands. He'd been roused from his bed by Winslow's men, and he looked tired and grumpy, but he was also a professional, a man who took his oath seriously. He quickly examined McGraw, his expression grave. "He's lost a lot of blood," he said, "and the wound is infected. But he's strong. He has a chance." He set to work, cleaning the wound again, removing any remaining debris, and stitching it up properly. He administered a dose of laudanum to ease McGraw's pain and help him sleep. He then gave Belle instructions on how to care for him, how to change the bandages, how to watch for signs of complications.
"He needs rest," the doctor said.
"And plenty of fluids. And he needs you." Belle nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, doctor," she said. "Thank you for saving him." The doctor smiled, a weary but kind smile. "He saved himself, Belle," he said. "He's a fighter." The doctor left, promising to return in a few days to check on McGraw's progress. Belle sat beside McGraw, watching him sleep, her heart filled with a mixture of relief, love, and hope. The days that followed were a blur of caring for McGraw, tending to his wounds, feeding him broth, keeping him hydrated, and waiting. He slept most of the time, his body healing, his strength slowly returning. Belle never left his side, except for brief moments to tend to the ranch, to make sure everything was running smoothly. She slept in a chair beside his bed, her hand always within reach of his. Slowly, gradually, McGraw began to improve. His fever broke, his breathing became stronger, his color returned. He started to wake up for longer periods, his eyes clearer, his mind sharper. One afternoon, as Belle was changing his bandages, he opened his eyes and looked at her, his gaze filled with a tenderness, a love that made her heart ache. "Belle," he whispered, his voice weak, but filled with emotion. "I'm here, Cass," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm here." He reached out with his good hand, his fingers gently caressing her cheek. "You saved me," he said. Belle smiled, tears welling up in her eyes.
"You saved yourself," she said.
"You're a fighter." "You bluffed," he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You bluffed, Winslow." Belle nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "I did," she said. "I learned from the best." He chuckled, a weak, raspy sound, but a sound that filled her with joy. He was getting better.
He was going to be all right.
Over the next few days, McGraw continued to improve. He started to sit up, to eat solid food, to walk around the room. He was still weak, still recovering, but he was alive, and he was getting stronger. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, McGraw took Belle's hand, his gaze intense, his voice filled with a sincerity that she couldn't doubt. "Belle," he said, I love you." Belle's heart overflowed with emotion. She looked at him, at his face, at his eyes, and she saw the truth of his words, the depth of his feelings. "I love you too, Cass," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I love you more than words can say." He pulled her close, his good arm wrapping around her, his touch gentle, his embrace filled with a tenderness that melted her heart. They sat there, in silence, watching the stars appear, their hearts intertwined, their futures uncertain, but their love was strong, unwavering, and true. The outlaw's gentle touch had healed not only his own wounds, but hers as well. The gamble had been won, not by cards or deceit, but by courage, by love, and by the unwavering belief in a second chance. The vast mesas spread out before them, bathed in the soft glow of twilight, a silent witness to the enduring power of the human heart. Chapter 11. Secrets Buried in the Shifting Sands. Life at the ranch slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the tranquility was a fragile veil over a landscape of simmering secrets and unresolved conflicts. McGraw's recovery was steady, his physical strength returning with each passing day. However, the emotional wounds, both his and Belle's, lingered, casting long shadows over their newfound happiness. Belle noticed a change in McGraw. He was more withdrawn, more pensive, often staring out at the vast expanse of the mesa with a haunted look in his eyes. He was still loving, still attentive, still her partner in every sense of the word, but there was a distance, a barrier she couldn't quite penetrate. She knew he was still hiding things from her, secrets from his past that continued to torment him. She tried to broach the subject, to encourage him to open up, to share his burdens, but he'd always deflected, changed the subject, or simply retreated into silence. She understood his reluctance. She knew that trust was earned, not given, and that the wounds of the past could take a long time to heal. But she also knew that their relationship couldn't truly thrive, couldn't reach its full potential, until those secrets were brought to light, until the ghosts of his past were laid to rest. One evening, as they were sitting by the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, Belle decided to try again. She'd found an old, leather-bound journal in a trunk in the attic, a journal that had belonged to her late husband, Thomas. She'd been reading through it, finding comfort in his words, in his memories, in his love for her. She handed the journal to McGraw. "This was Thomas's," she said. "I thought you might like to read it." McGraw took the journal, his fingers tracing the worn leather, his expression unreadable. He opened it, flipping through the pages, his eyes scanning the faded ink, the familiar handwriting. "He wrote about you," Belle said softly. "About how much he loved you. About his dreams for the ranch. About his fears." McGraw looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "His fears?"
"Ben no dead."
"He wrote about Winslow," she said. "About his suspicions. About his concerns." McGraw's jaw tightened, his gaze hardening. "What kind of concerns?" Belle hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She didn't want to upset him, didn't want to push him too hard. But she also knew that she couldn't keep avoiding the truth, couldn't keep pretending that everything was all right. He wrote about Winslow's illegal activities, she said, about his connections to outlaws, about his ruthlessness. McGraw's eyes narrowed, his gaze intense. He knew?
Ben nodded.
He suspected, she said. He didn't have proof, but he felt it. He knew Winslow was dangerous. McGraw closed the journal, his hand gripping it tightly. He stood up, walking to the window, his back to Belle. He stared out at the darkness, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of the moon. "There's more, isn't there?" Belle said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. McGraw didn't answer. He remained silent, his body tense, his shoulders hunched. Belle walked towards him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Cass," she said, her voice filled with concern.
"Please talk to me.
Tell me what's wrong." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a pain, a torment that made her heart ache. He looked at her, his gaze searching, his voice barely a whisper. "There are things I haven't told you, Belle. Things about my past. Things that could hurt you." Belle's heart pounded in her chest. She knew this was it. The moment of truth, the unveiling of the secrets that had haunted him for so long. "Tell me," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "I need to know." McGraw took a deep breath, his chest heaving. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear, shame, and love. "Before I came to Redemption Creek," he began, his voice low and rough, I was involved with some bad people. Outlaws. We robbed banks. Trains, we did things I'm not proud of." Belle listened, her heart aching for him, her mind reeling from the revelation. She'd suspected as much, of course, but hearing the words, hearing the confession, made it all too real. "There was one job," McGraw continued, his voice trembling slightly. "A bank robbery. It went wrong. People got hurt. People died." He paused, his eyes closing, his body shaking with the memory. I ran. I left my friends behind. I betrayed them." Belle's breath caught in her throat. She understood now. The guilt, the shame, the self-loathing that had haunted him for so long. He'd been running from his past, from his mistakes, from the consequences of his actions. "And Winslow," Belle said, her voice barely a whisper, "he knows?" McGraw nodded, his eyes filled with a despair that mirrored her own.
"Winslow, he was involved.
He helped us plan the robbery. He provided the information, the connections. He was one of us." The revelation hit Belle like a physical blow. Winslow, the man she'd always distrusted, the man who had tried to take her ranch, the man who had shot McGraw, was more than just a greedy landowner. He was an outlaw, a criminal, a murderer. And he knew McGraw's secret. He held it over him, a weapon he could use at any time to destroy him, to destroy them both. The shifting sands of their past had revealed a truth far more dangerous than Belle had ever imagined. The secrets, buried for so long, were now exposed, threatening to engulf them in a storm of violence and betrayal. The weight of it all pressed down on Belle, a heavy burden of fear and uncertainty. But amidst the fear, there was also a flicker of resolve. She would not let Winslow win. She would not let him destroy McGraw, destroy their love, destroy their future. She would fight. They would fight. Together. Chapter 12. A Dance with Destiny and Deceit. The revelation of McGraw's past, and Winslow's connection to it, cast a long shadow over the ranch. The fragile peace they had found was shattered, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread and uncertainty. Belle and McGraw were now bound together not only by love, but also by a shared secret, a shared danger, a shared enemy. They knew Winslow wouldn't hesitate to use McGraw's past against them, to blackmail them, to threaten them, to destroy them. They had to be prepared, had to be vigilant, had to be ready for anything. They spent hours discussing their options, weighing their choices, trying to formulate a plan. They considered going to Sheriff Brody, revealing everything, and asking for his protection. But they knew that Winslow had influence, connections, power that extended beyond Redemption Creek. Brody, for all his honesty and integrity, might not be able to protect them. He might even be compromised, unknowingly or otherwise, by Winslow's web of deceit. They considered running, leaving the ranch, disappearing, starting over somewhere new. But Belle was reluctant to abandon her home, her heritage, the land that had been in her family for generations. And McGraw, despite his past, had found a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, at the ranch. He didn't want to run anymore. He wanted to stand and fight. They decided, finally, that their best option was to confront Winslow, to expose him, to bring him to justice. But they knew it wouldn't be easy. Winslow was powerful, ruthless, and well-connected. They needed proof, evidence, something concrete that could tie him to the bank robbery, to the outlaws, to the murders. They started by searching the ranch house, looking for any clues, any information that Thomas might have left behind. They went through his old journals, his letters, his papers, searching for anything that could shed light on Winslow's activities, his connections, his secrets. They found a hidden compartment in Thomas's desk, a small, locked box that contained a collection of documents, letters, and a map. The documents detailed Winslow's land dealings, his financial transactions, his illegal activities. The letters were from various individuals, some of whom Belle recognized as known outlaws, discussing plans, schemes, and payments. The map was the most intriguing item. It was a detailed map of the surrounding area, marked with various locations, symbols, and codes. Belle and McGraw spent hours studying the map, trying to decipher its meaning, trying to understand its significance. They realized, finally, that the map was a guide to a hidden cache, a place where Winslow had stashed his ill-gotten gains, his loot from the bank robberies, his evidence. They knew that finding the cache, exposing its contents, would be the key to bringing Winslow down. But they also knew that it would be dangerous, that Winslow wouldn't hesitate to kill them to protect his secrets. They decided to take the risk. They had to. They had no other choice. They set out early one morning, following the map, their horses loaded with supplies, their hearts pounding in their chests. They rode for hours, through rugged terrain, across vast mesas, through narrow canyons, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon, their senses alert for any sign of danger. They reached the location marked on the map, a secluded cave hidden behind a waterfall, a place that was both beautiful and ominous. They dismounted, their guns drawn, their bodies tense, their minds racing. They entered the cave, the air cool and damp, the silence broken only by the sound of dripping water. They found the cache, a collection of wooden crates, metal boxes, and leather bags filled with money, gold, jewelry, and documents. The documents were the most damning evidence. They detailed Winslow's involvement in the bank robbery, his role in planning the crime, his share of the loot, his responsibility for the deaths. Belle and McGraw had found what they were looking for. They had the proof they needed to expose Winslow, to bring him to justice, to free themselves from his grasp. But as they were gathering the evidence, they heard a sound, a noise that made their blood run cold. It was the sound of horses approaching, the sound of men talking, the sound of Winslow. He'd followed them. He'd anticipated their move. He'd set a trap. Belle and McGraw were caught, cornered, outnumbered. They were in a desperate situation, a dance with destiny and deceit, a fight for their lives, a battle they might not win. Winslow entered the cave, his men behind him, their guns drawn, their faces grim. He smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile that sent a chill down Belle's spine. Well, he said, his voice echoing through the cave. Look what we have here. The widow Carter.
And her pet outlaw.
McGraw stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his gun, his eyes narrowed, his voice low and dangerous. It's over, Winslow, he said. We have the proof. We know everything. Winslow laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. You have nothing, he said. You have some old papers, some trinkets, some lies. Nobody will believe you. They'll believe this, Belle said, holding up one of the documents, a letter from Winslow to the leader of the outlaws, detailing his involvement in the bank robbery. Winslow's smile faltered, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. He hadn't expected them to find the cache, hadn't anticipated their discovery. That's a forgery, he said, his voice losing some of its confidence. A fake. It's real, Winslow, McGraw said. And you know it. It's time to pay for your crimes. Winslow's face turned red with anger, his fists clenching. He looked at his men, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. Kill them, he ordered. Kill them all. His men hesitated, looking at each other, unsure what to do. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outsmarted. They'd been caught in a trap of their own making, a web of deceit spun by their own boss. The dance was reaching its climax, the partners locked in a deadly embrace, the music a symphony of fear, betrayal, and the desperate hope for survival. The cave, once a sanctuary of secrets, was now a stage for a final confrontation, a reckoning that would determine the fate of them all. Chapter 13. The sheriff's shadowed past. Before Winslow's men could react, a voice boomed through the cave, a voice of authority, a voice of justice. Hold it right there, Winslow. Sheriff Brody stepped into the cave, his deputies behind him, their guns drawn and trained on Winslow and his men. He'd followed them, tracked them, anticipated their confrontation. He'd been suspicious of Winslow for years, but he'd never had enough evidence to act. Now, thanks to Bell and McGraw, he did. Winslow's men, seeing the sheriff and his deputies, lowered their weapons, surrendering without a fight. They were hired hands, not killers, and they had no desire to die for Winslow's crimes. Winslow himself stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief, anger, and fear. He'd been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and outlawed. His reign of terror was over. You're under arrest, Winslow, Brody said, his voice cold and hard. For attempted murder, robbery, conspiracy, and a whole lot more. Brody's deputies moved to disarm and handcuff Winslow, but he resisted, struggling against their grip, his eyes filled with a desperate rage. You can't do this to me, Brody, he snarled.
I'm Bart Winslow.
I own this town. You own nothing anymore, Winslow, Brody said, his voice unwavering. Your time is up. As Winslow was being led away, he turned to Bell and McGraw, his eyes filled with hatred, his voice dripping with venom. This isn't over, he hissed. I'll get you for this. I'll make you pay. Bell and McGraw watched him go, their hearts pounding in their chests, their bodies trembling with relief, but also with a lingering sense of unease. They knew Winslow was a dangerous man, a man who wouldn't give up easily, a man who would seek revenge. Brody turned to Bell and McGraw, his expression a mixture of gratitude and concern. You two all right? He asked. We're fine, Sheriff, Bell said, her voice surprisingly steady. Thanks to you. You did good, Bell, Brody said. You and McGraw. You brought down a powerful, dangerous man. He paused, his gaze shifting to McGraw, his expression softening slightly. I know about your past, McGraw, he said quietly. About the bank robbery. About your friends. McGraw's jaw tightened, his eyes filled with apprehension. He expected Brody to arrest him, to take him away, to punish him. But Brody didn't. He simply looked at him, his eyes filled with a surprising understanding, a compassion. I also know that you saved Belle's life, Brody said. That you risked your own life to protect her.
That you changed.
He paused again, his gaze sweeping the cave, taking in the evidence of Winslow's crimes. Sometimes, he said, his voice low and thoughtful, the line between outlaw and lawman, it gets blurred. Sometimes, we all make mistakes. Sometimes, we all need a second chance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver badge, a sheriff's badge. He held it out to McGraw. I could use a good deputy, Brody said. Someone who knows the land. Someone who knows the people. Someone who knows the outlaws. McGraw stared at the badge, his eyes widening in disbelief. He looked at Bell, his gaze questioning, his heart filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Belle smiled, her eyes filled with tears of joy. She nodded, her voice filled with love and pride. Take it, Cass, she said. You deserve it. McGraw took the badge, his fingers trembling slightly. He pinned it to his shirt, the silver gleaming in the dim light of the cave. He looked at Brody, his eyes filled with gratitude, his voice filled with resolve.
I won't let you down, Sheriff, he said.
Brody smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes.
I know you won't, McGraw, he said.
I know you won't. As they left the cave, Belle and McGraw looked at each other, their hearts filled with a sense of relief, a sense of peace, a sense of hope. They'd faced their demons, confronted their past, and won. They'd found justice, redemption, and love. But as they rode back to the ranch, a nagging question lingered in Belle's mind. How had Brody known where to find them? How had he known about the cache, about Winslow's plans, about McGraw's past? She asked him, her voice hesitant, her gaze questioning. Brody smiled, a knowing smile that held a hint of sadness. I've been watching Winslow for years, Belle, he said. I've always suspected him, but I never had enough proof. I needed help. He paused, his gaze shifting to McGraw, his expression softening. I knew about McGraw's past, he said. I knew about the bank robbery. I was there. Belle's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Brody, her eyes widening in disbelief. You were there? Brody nodded, his eyes filled with a pain, a regret, that mirrored McGraw's own. I was a young deputy then, he said. I was part of the posse that chased McGraw and his friends. I saw the whole thing. He paused again, his voice dropping to a whisper. I also saw who shot first. I saw who was responsible for the deaths. It wasn't McGraw. It was Winslow. The revelation hit Belle like a physical blow. Brody, the man she'd trusted, the man who had upheld the law, the man who had saved them, had carried his own secret, his own burden, his own shadowed past. He'd been a witness to Winslow's crimes, but he hadn't been able to act, hadn't been able to bring him to justice. He'd been bound by the law, by the lack of evidence, by his own fear. But he'd also seen McGraw's courage, his remorse, his potential for redemption. He'd waited, watched, and hoped. He'd waited for the right moment, the right opportunity, to make things right.
And now he had.
He'd used Belle and McGraw, manipulated them, guided them, to expose Winslow, to bring him to justice, to atone for his own past mistakes. The sheriff's shadowed past had intertwined with their own, creating a tapestry of deceit, betrayal, and ultimately, redemption. The lines between outlaw and lawman had blurred, revealing the complex, flawed, and ultimately human nature of them all. The cave, once a symbol of hidden secrets, was now a testament to the enduring power of truth, justice, and the possibility of second chances. Chapter 14. Promises Forged in Fire. The aftermath of Winslow's arrest was a whirlwind of activity. The news spread like wildfire through Redemption Creek and the surrounding territories, causing a mixture of shock, disbelief, and relief. Winslow's empire, built on lies, deceit, and violence, crumbled overnight. His properties were seized, his assets frozen, his henchmen scattered. Belle and McGraw, hailed as heroes, were thrust into the spotlight, their story becoming a legend, a testament to their courage, their resilience, and their love. They were interviewed by reporters, celebrated by the townspeople, and scrutinized by those who still doubted McGraw's transformation. McGraw, now officially Deputy McGraw, took his new role seriously. He worked alongside Sheriff Brody, helping to restore order, to rebuild trust, and to make amends for his past. He was a natural lawman, his knowledge of the outlaw world proving invaluable in tracking down criminals, solving crimes, and keeping the peace. He was also a changed man. The darkness that had haunted him for so long seemed to have lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of redemption. He was still the rugged, dangerous man Belle had fallen in love with, but he was also something more. He was a protector, a defender, a lawman. Belle, meanwhile, focused on rebuilding her ranch, restoring it to its former glory, and preparing for the future. She hired new hands, repaired the fences, restocked the cattle, and planted new crops. She also started making plans for Sarah's arrival, preparing a room for her and her soon-to-be-born child. She and McGraw worked side by side, their love deepening with each passing day. They shared their hopes, their dreams, their fears, their plans. They talked about marriage, about children, about a future together. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, McGraw took Belle's hand, his gaze intense, his voice filled with emotion. "Belle," he said, I want to marry you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to build a family with you." Belle's heart overflowed with joy. She looked at him, at his face, at his eyes, and she saw the truth of his words, the depth of his love. "Yes, Cass," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you. I love you more than words can say." He pulled her close, his embrace tight, his kiss passionate, his love unwavering. They held each other, their hearts intertwined, their futures uncertain, but their love was a beacon of hope, a promise of a brighter tomorrow. They decided to have a simple wedding, a small ceremony at the ranch, with just a few close friends and family. They invited Sheriff Brody, Jed, and of course, Sarah, who was due to arrive any day now. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the desert air crisp and cool, the sky a vast expanse of blue. Belle dressed in a simple, white dress, her mother's silver concho belt cinching her waist, her hair braided and adorned with wildflowers. McGraw wore a new suit, his deputy's badge gleaming on his chest, his eyes filled with love and pride. They stood before the makeshift altar, a weathered wooden table draped with a white cloth, the setting sun casting a golden glow on their faces. Sheriff Brody, acting as both lawman and officiant, read the vows, his voice filled with emotion, his eyes twinkling with pride. Belle and McGraw exchanged their vows, their voices trembling slightly, but filled with sincerity, with love, with hope. They promised to love each other, to cherish each other, to support each other, through good times and bad, through sickness and health, through life and death. They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that symbolized their eternal bond, their unbreakable commitment, their unwavering love. They kissed, a passionate, tender kiss that sealed their vows, their promises, their future. As they embraced, a cheer erupted from the small gathering, a celebration of their love, their happiness, their new beginning. They were surrounded by friends, by family, by love. But as Belle looked out at the crowd, she noticed a figure standing at the edge of the gathering, a figure she hadn't expected to see, a figure that brought a sudden chill to her heart. It was Winslow's son, a young man named Cole, who had been away at school during the events of the past few weeks. He'd returned to find his father arrested, his family disgraced, his future shattered. He stood there, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, grief, and hatred. He looked at Belle, at McGraw, his gaze intense, his expression menacing. Belle felt a sudden surge of fear, a premonition of danger, a sense of foreboding. She knew that Winslow's legacy of violence, of hatred, of revenge, still lived on. McGraw noticed Cole as well, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip, his eyes narrowing, his body tensing. He knew that this was not over, that the dance with destiny and deceit was not yet finished, that the promises forged in fire would be tested once again. The wedding, a celebration of love and new beginnings, was now overshadowed by the looming threat of a past that refused to stay buried, a past that would demand one final, desperate reckoning. The sun, setting on their wedding day, cast long shadows across the ranch, a reminder that even in the brightest moments, darkness could still lurk, waiting to strike. Chapter 15. The Renegade's Reckoning. The appearance of Cole Winslow cast a pall over the wedding celebration. The joyous atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a palpable tension, a sense of foreboding that hung heavy in the air. Belle and McGraw exchanged a worried glance, their unspoken fears mirroring each other. They knew that Cole's presence was not a coincidence, that he was there for a reason, and that reason was likely revenge. McGraw, his hand still resting on the butt of his gun, slowly moved towards Cole, his eyes narrowed, his body tense, ready for anything. Belle, her heart pounding in her chest, followed close behind, her own hand instinctively reaching for the small pistol she carried hidden in the folds of her dress. As they approached, Cole turned to face them, his eyes blazing with hatred, his face contorted with grief and anger. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, but he carried himself with a confidence and arrogance that mirrored his father's. "McGraw," Cole spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You did this. You ruined my family. You took everything from us." McGraw's expression remained calm, his voice steady, despite the threat that Cole presented. "Your father ruined himself, Cole," he said. "He made his choices. He paid the price." "He was framed," Cole retorted, his voice rising in anger. "You, and that woman set him up. You lied. You cheated. You murdered him." "Your father was a criminal, Cole," Belle said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "He tried to kill us. He deserved what he got." Cole's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to Belle, his expression filled with a hatred that made her blood run cold. "You'll pay for this," he hissed. "Both of you. I swear it." He turned and stormed away, disappearing into the gathering darkness, leaving Belle and McGraw standing there, their hearts pounding in their chests, their minds racing with possibilities, with fears, with plans. They knew that Cole's threat was not an idle one. He was Winslow's son, and he would be driven by a desire for revenge, a need to restore his family's honor, a lust for blood. They returned to the wedding celebration, trying to put on a brave face, trying to reassure their guests, trying to pretend that everything was all right. But the joy had gone out of the day, replaced by a sense of unease, a sense of danger. Sheriff Brody, sensing the tension, approached Belle and McGraw, his expression concerned. "You all right?" he asked. "We will be," Sheriff McGraw said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "We'll handle it." Brody nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "Be careful," he said. "Cole Winslow is dangerous. He's his father's son." The wedding celebration ended early, the guests departing with a mixture of well wishes and apprehension. Belle and McGraw were left alone, standing on the porch of their ranch house, the silence of the night broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. They knew they had to be prepared, had to be vigilant, had to be ready for anything. They knew that Cole Winslow would be back, that he would try to make good on his threat, that he would seek revenge. They spent the night discussing their options, weighing their choices, trying to formulate a plan. They considered leaving the ranch, going into hiding, seeking protection from Sheriff Brody. But they knew that running wouldn't solve anything, that Cole would eventually find them, that they couldn't live their lives in fear. They decided, finally, that their best option was to stay and fight. They would defend their home, their love, their future. They would face Cole Winslow, just as they had faced his father, and they would win. They spent the next few days preparing, fortifying the ranch, setting traps, and waiting. They knew that Cole wouldn't attack immediately, that he would bide his time, plan his move, and strike when they least expected it. They were right. A week later, as Belle was tending to the horses in the corral, she heard a sound, a noise that made her blood run cold. It was the sound of a gunshot, followed by the whinny of a horse, followed by silence. She knew instantly what had happened. Cole had attacked. She grabbed her rifle, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with fear and determination. She ran towards the sound of the shot, her eyes scanning the landscape, her senses alert for any sign of danger. She found McGraw lying on the ground, his body still, his shirt stained with blood. He'd been shot in the back, ambushed by Cole, struck down without warning. Belle's world shattered. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with tears.
"Cass,"
she cried, her voice choked with emotion.
"Cass,
please don't leave me." She felt for his pulse, her fingers desperately searching for a sign of life. It was there, weak and thready, but still there. He was alive, but barely. She knew she had to get him to safety, had to get him medical attention, had to save him. But she also knew that Cole was still out there, waiting, watching, ready to finish the job. She looked around, her eyes scanning the landscape, her mind racing. She saw a small, rocky outcrop, a natural hiding place, a place where she could take McGraw, protect him, and fight back. She dragged him, his body heavy and limp, towards the rocks, her muscles straining, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She managed to get him into the shelter of the rocks, laying him down gently, her hands covering his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. She then turned, her rifle in hand, her eyes filled with a fury, a determination, a rage she'd never felt before. She would avenge McGraw. She would make Cole Winslow pay. She would kill him. The renegade's reckoning had come, not for McGraw, but for Belle. She was no longer the saloon owner, the widow, the gambler. She was a warrior, a protector, a lover seeking vengeance. The sun beat down mercilessly, casting harsh shadows across the landscape, a stark reminder of the violence that had erupted and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Chapter 16. Echoes through the Canyon of Loss. Belle positioned herself behind the rocky outcrop, her rifle trained on the open ground, her senses hyper-alert, her heart pounding a rhythm of fear and fury. She knew Cole Winslow was out there, somewhere, hidden among the rocks and brush, waiting for his chance to finish what he'd started. She also knew that she was outmatched, outgunned, and alone. But she wouldn't give up. She wouldn't surrender. She would fight for McGraw, for their love, for their future. She would avenge him, even if it meant sacrificing her own life. She waited, the silence of the desert broken only by the occasional gust of wind and the distant cry of a hawk. She scanned the landscape, her eyes searching for any sign of movement, any hint of Cole's presence. She knew he was a skilled hunter, a tracker, a killer. He'd learned from the best, from his father, and he would be a formidable opponent. Suddenly, a shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past Belle's head, striking the rock beside her, sending splinters of stone flying. She ducked, her body instinctively seeking cover, her heart leaping into her throat. She knew he'd found her. He was close. And he was hunting her. She returned fire, aiming at the spot where she'd seen the muzzle flash, her shots echoing through the canyon, the sound a desperate cry of defiance, a challenge to her enemy. She didn't hit him. She knew that. He was too well hidden, too careful, too experienced. Another shot rang out, this one closer, the bullet striking the ground near her feet, showering her with dirt and debris. She realized she was pinned down, trapped, her position compromised. She had to move. She had to find a better position, a place where she could defend herself, a place where she could fight back. She crawled, her body low to the ground, her rifle clutched in her hand, her eyes scanning the landscape, her mind racing. She reached a small crevice, a narrow gap between two large boulders, a place where she could hide, a place where she could ambush him. She squeezed into the crevice, her body pressed against the cold, hard rock, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She waited, her rifle ready, her senses alert, her heart pounding in her chest. She heard him then, his footsteps, soft and stealthy, approaching her hiding place. He was close, very close. She held her breath, her finger tightening on the trigger, her body tensed, ready to strike. He appeared, his silhouette framed against the bright sunlight, his rifle raised, his eyes searching, his body vulnerable.
Belle fit raide.
Her shot was true, hitting Cole in the chest, the force of the impact throwing him backwards, his body collapsing to the ground, his rifle falling from his grasp. He lay there, still and silent, his eyes staring up at the sky, his life extinguished. Belle emerged from her hiding place, her rifle still trained on Cole's body, her legs trembling, her body shaking with the aftermath of the confrontation. She approached him cautiously, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief, sorrow, and regret. She had killed him. She had taken a life. She had avenged McGraw. But the victory felt hollow, empty, meaningless. She'd killed a young man, a man who was driven by grief, by anger, by revenge. She'd stopped him, yes, but she hadn't solved anything. She'd only perpetuated the cycle of violence, the cycle of loss. She knelt beside Cole's body, her eyes filled with tears. She felt a pang of sympathy for him, a sense of shared grief. He was Winslow's son, yes, but he was also a victim of his father's sins, a victim of circumstance. She closed his eyes, a gesture of respect, a silent acknowledgement of his humanity. She then turned her attention to McGraw, her heart filled with a desperate hope, a fervent prayer. She rushed back to the rocky outcrop, finding him still alive, but his breathing was shallow, his pulse weak, his skin cold. She knew he was dying. She knew she couldn't save him. She knew she was losing him. She knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap, her tears falling onto his face. "Cass," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Cass, please don't leave me. I love you. I need you." He opened his eyes, his gaze weak, but filled with love. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers gently caressing her cheek. "Belle," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I love you." His hand fell limp, his eyes closed, his breathing stopped. He was gone. Belle's world crumbled around her. She screamed, a primal scream of grief, of loss, of despair. Her cries echoed through the canyon, a mournful lament for the man she loved, for the future they had lost, for the emptiness that now consumed her. The echoes, reverberating through the canyon of loss, carried the weight of her sorrow, a testament to the devastating power of violence and the enduring pain of a love cut short. The sun, once a symbol of hope and new beginnings, now seemed to mock her with its relentless brightness, a cruel reminder of the darkness that had fallen upon her world. Chapter 17. The Unveiling of Hidden Truths. The days following McGraw's death were a blur of grief and despair for Belle. She felt numb, empty, lost in a world that had suddenly become cold, harsh, and meaningless. She went through the motions of life, tending to the ranch, caring for the animals, but her heart wasn't in it. Her spirit was broken. Sheriff Brody and Jed were constant sources of support, helping her with the chores, offering her comfort, and keeping her company. They tried to console her, to reassure her, to bring her back to life. But Belle remained withdrawn, lost in her grief, unable to move on, unable to accept her loss. She spent hours sitting by McGraw's grave, a simple wooden cross marking the spot where he lay buried, overlooking the vast expanse of the mesa, the land he had come to love, the land where he had found redemption and death. She talked to him, telling him about her day, about her feelings, about her loneliness. She poured out her heart to him, her tears watering the dry earth, her grief a silent testament to the depth of her love. One afternoon, as she was sitting by his grave, she noticed something glinting in the sunlight, a small, metallic object partially buried in the dirt. She picked it up, her fingers brushing away the soil, revealing a tarnished, silver locket. She recognized it immediately. It was McGraw's locket, the one he always wore, the one he'd never taken off. She'd never seen it open, never known what it contained, never asked. She opened it, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside there were two small, faded photographs. One was of a young woman, beautiful and smiling, with kind eyes and a gentle face. The other was of a young boy, no more than 5 years old, with McGraw's dark eyes and mischievous grin. Belle's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the photographs, her mind reeling, her heart aching with a new wave of grief, a new understanding of McGraw's past. She realized, finally, who the woman was. It was the woman he'd spoken of, the one who had betrayed him, the one he had loved and lost. And the boy was his son. A son he'd never known, a son he'd never mentioned, a son he'd left behind. The revelation hit Belle like a physical blow. She felt a surge of anger, of betrayal, of confusion. Why hadn't he told her? Why had he kept this secret from her? Why had he lied? But as she looked at the photographs again, at the woman's gentle face, at the boy's innocent smile, her anger faded, replaced by a profound sadness, a deep empathy for McGraw. She understood now the weight of his guilt, the depth of his pain, the reason for his silence. He'd been running from his past, yes, but he'd also been running from his love. He'd been afraid to love again, afraid to trust again, afraid to open his heart. He'd loved Belle, yes, but he'd never fully given himself to her. He'd held back, kept a part of himself hidden, protected, guarded. He'd been afraid of hurting her, afraid of losing her. And in the end, he had lost her. Not because of his past, not because of his secrets, but because of violence. Belle closed the locket, holding it tightly in her hand, her tears falling onto its tarnished surface. She felt a renewed sense of grief, a deeper understanding of McGraw's pain, a forgiveness for his silence. She realized that his past, his secrets, didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the love they had shared, the connection they had forged, the future they had dreamed of. She decided to find his son. She had to. She owed it to McGraw, to his memory, to his love. She went to Sheriff Brody, showing him the locket, telling him about the photographs, asking for his help. Brody listened, his expression grave, his eyes filled with compassion. "I know about the woman, Belle," he said. "Her name was Sarah. She died a few years after McGraw left. She was killed in a stagecoach robbery." Belle's heart ached for McGraw, for the loss he had endured, for the pain he had carried. "And the boy?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do you know what happened to him?" Brody nodded. "He was taken in by her family," he said. "They lived in a town called Havenwood, about a week's ride from here." Belle's heart leaped with hope. She had a lead, a direction, a purpose. She would find McGraw's son. She would tell him about his father, about his courage, about his love. She would connect him to his past. She prepared for the journey, packing her bags, saddling her horse, and saying goodbye to McGraw. She stood by his grave, the locket clutched in her hand, her tears falling onto the dry earth. "I'll find him, Cass," she whispered. "I promise you. I'll find your son. And I'll tell him about you. I'll tell him how much you loved him." She mounted her horse, her heart filled with a mixture of grief, determination, and hope. She rode away from the ranch, leaving behind the ghosts of her past, embarking on a new journey, a journey of discovery, a journey of healing. The unveiling of hidden truths had brought both pain and purpose, revealing the depths of McGraw's past and setting Belle on a new path, a path that would lead her to his son and, perhaps, to her own redemption. The vast landscape stretched out before her, a silent witness to her journey, a testament to the enduring power of love, loss, and the unwavering search for connection. Chapter 18. A desperate ride for redemption. The journey to Havenwood was long and arduous, taking Belle through rugged terrain, across vast plains, and over towering mountains. She rode alone, her only companions the wind, the sun, and the memories of McGraw. She thought about him constantly, about his smile, his touch, his voice, his love. She replayed their moments together, the laughter, the tears, the promises. She clung to those memories, drawing strength from them, using them to fuel her determination, to keep her going. She faced numerous challenges along the way. She encountered storms, wild animals, and the occasional outlaw. But she persevered, her resolve unwavering, her purpose clear. She was on a mission of love, a mission of redemption. She used her skills as a gambler, her knowledge of the land, her courage, to overcome the obstacles, to survive the dangers, to reach her destination. She bartered for supplies, traded information, and bluffed her way out of trouble. She also encountered kindness along the way. She met ranchers, farmers, and townspeople who offered her food, shelter, and guidance. They shared their stories with her, their hopes, their dreams, their losses. They reminded her of the goodness in the world, the resilience of the human spirit, the power of connection. As she rode, she reflected on her life, on her choices, on her mistakes. She thought about her late husband, Thomas, about her daughter, Sarah, about McGraw. She realized that she'd spent much of her life running from pain, running from loss, running from love. She'd built walls around her heart, protecting herself from hurt, from vulnerability. She'd convinced herself that she was strong, independent, self-sufficient. But she'd also been lonely. McGraw had broken down those walls, shown her the power of connection, the beauty of love, the possibility of happiness. He'd given her a second chance, a chance to open her heart, a chance to live again. And she'd lost him. She'd lost him to violence, to the past, to fate. But she wouldn't let his death be in vain. She would honor his memory, fulfill his unspoken wish, find a son, and connect him to his father. Finally, after weeks of travel, she reached Havenwood, a small, quiet town nestled in a valley, surrounded by rolling hills and lush meadows. It was a peaceful place, a stark contrast to the harshness of the desert, a sanctuary. She asked around, inquiring about Sarah's family, seeking information about McGraw's son. She learned that Sarah's parents had passed away a few years earlier, and that the boy, whose name was Ethan, had been raised by his aunt, Sarah's sister, a woman named Martha. Belle found Martha's house, a modest but well-kept home on the outskirts of town. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She was about to meet McGraw's son, a young man who didn't know his father, a young man who deserved the truth. She took a deep breath, steeled herself, and knocked on the door. A woman answered, her face kind and welcoming, her eyes filled with a gentle warmth. She was older, her hair streaked with gray, but she had Sarah's smile, Sarah's eyes. "Can I help you?" Martha asked, her voice soft and curious. Belle hesitated, unsure how to begin, how to explain, how to reveal the truth. "My name is Belle Carter," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. I knew Cass McGraw." Martha's eyes widened slightly, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise. "Cass?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "You knew Cass?" Belle nodded, her heart aching with the memory of McGraw, with the loss she felt, with the love she still carried. "I did," she said. "And I have something to tell you. Something about his son." Martha's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Belle, her eyes searching, her expression unreadable. She knew. She'd always known. "Come in," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Please come in." Belle entered the house, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with possibilities, with fears, with hope. She was about to embark on a new chapter, a chapter of revelation, of connection, of healing. The desperate ride for redemption had led her to this moment, to this place, to this truth. The vast landscape outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching, as Belle stepped across the threshold, carrying the weight of McGraw's past and the promise of a future yet to be written. The sun, setting on another day, cast long shadows across the room, a reminder of the darkness that had been, but also of the light that could still be found, in the connection between a father and his son, and in the unwavering love of a woman who had dared to ride through the storm. Chapter 19. Love's Last Stand at Sunset. Belle sat down with Martha, the two women facing each other across a small, wooden table, the air thick with unspoken emotions, with years of hidden truths, with the weight of McGraw's past. Belle told Martha everything. She told her about her life with McGraw, about their love, about their struggles, about his death. She told her about the bank robbery, about Winslow, about Cole. She told her about the locket, about the photographs, about Ethan. Martha listened, her eyes filled with tears, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't interrupt, didn't question, didn't judge. She simply absorbed the truth, the pain, the love. When Belle finished, Martha was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the floor, her body trembling slightly. Then, she looked up, her eyes meeting Belle's, her expression filled with a mixture of grief, gratitude, and understanding. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for telling me. Thank you for finding us." She paused, her gaze shifting to a photograph on the mantelpiece, a photograph of a young man, tall and handsome, with McGraw's dark eyes and mischievous grin. "That's Ethan," she said, her voice filled with pride. He's a good boy. A good man. He looks like his father, Belle said, her voice choked with emotion. Martha nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. He does, she agreed. He always wondered about him. He always longed to know him. I have something for him, Belle said, reaching into her bag and pulling out the tarnished silver locket. It was McGraw's. It has pictures of his mother and him. She handed the locket to Martha, their fingers brushing, a silent exchange of grief, of love, of connection. Martha took the locket, her hands trembling, her eyes fixed on its worn surface. She opened it, her breath catching in her throat as she gazed at the faded photographs, the images of the man she had known and loved, and the son she had never met. He kept it all these years, she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. He never forgot them. He loved them, Belle said, her voice firm, her heart aching with the truth of her words. He loved them both very much. Martha closed the locket, holding it tightly in her hand, her tears falling onto its tarnished surface. I'll give it to him, she said. I'll tell him everything. Belle and Martha talked for hours, sharing stories, memories, and grief. They talked about McGraw, about his life, about his struggles, about his redemption. They talked about Sarah, about her kindness, about her beauty, about her love for McGraw. They formed a bond, a connection forged in shared loss, in shared love, in shared understanding. They were two women from different worlds, brought together by a man they had both loved, a man who had left his mark on their lives. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the room, Martha stood up, her expression resolute. Ethan's working at the blacksmith shop, she said. He'll be home soon. I want you to meet him. Belle's heart pounded in her chest. She was about to meet McGraw's son, the young man who didn't know his father, the young man who deserved the truth. She waited, her anticipation mixed with apprehension, her hope mingled with fear. She didn't know what to expect, how Ethan would react, how he would feel. Finally, she heard the sound of footsteps, the opening of a door, the voice of a young man. I'm home, Aunt Martha, Ethan called out, his voice cheerful, his tone light. He entered the room, stopping short when he saw Belle, his eyes widening in surprise, his expression questioning. He was tall and handsome, with McGraw's dark eyes and mischievous grin, but there was also a gentleness in his face, a kindness in his gaze, that reminded Belle of Sarah. Martha stepped forward, placing a hand on Ethan's arm, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan, she said, this is Belle Carter. She knew your father. Ethan's eyes widened further, his expression shifting from surprise to shock. He looked at Belle, his gaze searching, his mind racing, his heart pounding. My father? He repeated, his voice barely a whisper. You knew my father? Belle nodded, her eyes filled with tears, her voice choked with emotion. I did, she said. And I have something to tell you about him. Something important. She took a deep breath, steeled herself, and began to tell him the story of Cass McGraw, the outlaw, the gambler, the renegade. She told him about his father's life, his struggles, his love. She told him about his mother, about her beauty, about her kindness, about her death. She told him everything, holding nothing back, revealing the truth, the whole truth, the painful truth. Ethan listened, his eyes fixed on Belle's face, his expression a mixture of disbelief, shock, and grief. He didn't interrupt, didn't question, didn't judge. He simply absorbed the story, the weight of his father's past, the legacy of his love. When Belle finished, Ethan was silent for a long moment, his body trembling slightly, his eyes filled with tears. Then, he reached out, his hand gently touching Belle's arm, his voice barely a whisper. Thank you, he said. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for finding me. He looked at the locket in his aunt's hand, his gaze filled with a longing, a yearning, a love he'd never known. He reached for it, his fingers tracing its worn surface, his heart aching with a connection to his father. Belle, Martha, and Ethan spent the evening together, sharing stories, memories, and grief. They talked about McGraw, about his life, about his legacy, about his love. They forged a bond, a connection, a family. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room. Belle knew that her journey had come to an end. She'd found McGraw's son. She'd told him the truth. She'd fulfilled her promise. She'd also found something for herself. She'd found peace, healing, and a new sense of purpose. She'd found a connection to McGraw's past, a connection to his future. She knew that she would never forget McGraw, that she would always love him, that she would always carry him in her heart. But she also knew that she could move on, that she could find happiness again, that she could live again. Love's last stand at sunset had been a battle fought not with guns or violence, but with truth, with forgiveness, with connection. The echoes of loss still lingered, but they were now accompanied by a new melody, a melody of hope, of healing, of love. The vast landscape outside, bathed in the soft glow of twilight, seemed to whisper a promise of a brighter future, a future where the past could be honored, the present embraced, and the future welcomed with open arms. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Belle stayed with Martha and Ethan for a few days, getting to know them, sharing stories, and building a bond. She felt a connection to them, a sense of family, a belonging she hadn't expected to find. Ethan was a kind, gentle, and intelligent young man, with a strong sense of justice and a deep longing for connection. He was eager to learn about his father, to understand his past, to embrace his legacy. Belle told him everything she knew, sharing her memories of McGraw, both the good and the bad, the triumphs and the failures. She showed him pictures, letters, and the wooden wolf McGraw had carved, a tangible link to his father's past. Ethan listened intently, absorbing every detail, every nuance, every emotion. He asked questions, sought clarification, and processed the information with a maturity that belied his years. He was both proud and saddened by his father's story, a mixture of admiration for his courage and regret for his mistakes. He understood the choices McGraw had made, the path he had taken, the consequences he had faced. He also recognized the love that McGraw had carried for him, the unspoken yearning, the silent regret. He felt a connection to his father, a bond that transcended time and space, a love that had endured despite the separation. Belle also learned more about Ethan's life, about his upbringing, about his dreams, about his future. He was a skilled blacksmith, a craftsman with a passion for his work, a man of integrity. He'd grown up without a father, but he'd been surrounded by love, by the support of his aunt and his community. He'd built a good life for himself, a life of purpose, a life of meaning. Belle realized that McGraw would have been proud of him, proud of the man he had become, proud of the legacy he had left behind. As the days passed, Belle felt a sense of peace, a sense of healing, a sense of closure. She'd fulfilled her promise to McGraw. She'd found a son. She'd connected them. She'd also found something for herself. She'd found a new family, a new connection, a new hope. She knew it was time to return to Redemption Creek, to her ranch, to her life. But she also knew that she wouldn't be going back alone. She would be carrying with her the memories of McGraw, the love of Ethan, and the promise of a brighter future. She said goodbye to Martha and Ethan, their farewells filled with tears, with hugs, with promises to stay in touch. They had formed a bond, a connection, a family that would endure despite the distance. Belle rode away from Havenwood, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and joy. She was leaving behind a newfound family, but she was also returning to her home, to her life. As she rode, she reflected on her journey, on the challenges she'd faced, on the lessons she'd learned. She'd come to Havenwood seeking closure, seeking redemption, seeking connection. And she'd found it. She'd found it in the most unexpected place, in the most unexpected way, in the heart of McGraw's son. She reached Redemption Creek, the familiar landscape welcoming her back, the setting sun casting long shadows across the mesa. She rode to her ranch, her heart filled with a sense of homecoming. But as she approached the ranch house, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure was standing on the porch, a figure she recognized, a figure she feared. It was Cole Winslow. He'd escaped. He'd somehow managed to get free, to evade the law, to return to Redemption Creek. And he was waiting for her. Belle's heart pounded in her chest. She knew this was it, the final confrontation, the ultimate reckoning, the end of the line. She dismounted, her hand resting on the gun at her hip, her eyes narrowed, her body tense, ready for anything. Cole smiled, a cruel, menacing smile that sent a chill down her spine. Well, 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 he said, his voice dripping with venom. Look who's back. The widow Carter. All alone. What do you want, Cole? Belle asked, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering.
I want what's mine, he said.
I want my ranch back. I want my revenge.
I want you dead.
He pulled out a gun, aiming it at Belle, his finger tightening on the trigger, his eyes filled with hatred. Belle knew she had no choice. She had to fight. She had to defend herself. She had to survive. She drew her own gun, firing at Cole, her shot echoing through the stillness of the evening, the sound a desperate cry of defiance. But Cole was faster. His shot hit Belle in the shoulder, the force of the impact throwing her backwards, her body collapsing to the ground, her gun falling from her grasp. She lay there, stunned, her vision blurring, her body numb, her life ebbing away. Cole approached her, his gun still trained on her, his smile widening, his eyes filled with triumph. It's over, widow, he said. You lost. He raised his gun, aiming it at her head, his finger ready to pull the trigger, his revenge about to be complete. But then, a shot rang out, a shot from behind Cole, shot that found its mark. Cole staggered, his eyes widening in surprise, his body collapsing to the ground, his gun falling from his grasp. He lay there, still and silent, his life extinguished. Belle looked up, her vision clearing, her mind racing, her heart pounding. Standing behind Cole's body, a smoking gun in his hand, was Ethan. He'd followed her. He'd somehow known, somehow sensed that she was in danger. He'd saved her. Ethan rushed to Belle's side, his eyes filled with concern, his voice trembling. Are you all right? He asked. Belle managed a weak smile, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude, of relief, of love. I am now, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Thanks to you. Ethan helped her up, his arms supporting her, his touch gentle, his strength unwavering. They stood there, together, the setting sun casting long shadows across the ranch, the echoes of gunfire fading into the stillness of the evening. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons had come to an end. The violence, the hatred, the revenge had been silenced. Love, courage, and connection had triumphed. Belle and Ethan, bound by the legacy of McGraw, by the shared loss, by the newfound family, looked at each other, their hearts filled with a sense of peace, a sense of healing, a sense of hope. The vast landscape stretched out before them, a silent witness to their journey, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a promise of a brighter future. The final showdown had not been about revenge, but about the enduring strength of love and family, a testament to the bonds that could be forged even in the face of unimaginable loss. Epilogue. Years passed. Belle and Ethan rebuilt the ranch, transforming it into a thriving enterprise, a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of new beginnings. They worked side by side, their bond deepening with each passing day, their shared love for McGraw a constant source of strength and connection. Ethan married a local woman, a kind and gentle soul named Mary, and they had children, filling the ranch house with laughter, with joy, with life. Belle became a grandmother, a role she embraced with fierce love and unwavering devotion. She cherished her grandchildren, seeing in them the echoes of McGraw, the promise of the future. Sheriff Brody remained a close friend, a constant presence in their lives, a pillar of the community. He eventually retired, passing the badge on to a younger man, but he continued to offer his wisdom, his guidance, and his support. The story of Belle and McGraw became a legend, a tale told and retold around campfires and in saloons, a testament to their courage, their love, and their redemption. Their names were etched in the history of Redemption Creek, a reminder that even in the harshest of landscapes, hope could blossom, love could endure, and second chances could be found. Belle never forgot McGraw. She carried his memory in her heart, his love a guiding light, his spirit a constant presence. She often visited his grave, sharing her thoughts, her feelings, her stories. She knew he was at peace, watching over her, guiding her and loving her. She also found a new peace, a new happiness, a new purpose. She'd lived a full life, a life filled with challenges, with loss, with love. She'd made mistakes, yes, but she'd also learned from them. She'd found strength in vulnerability, courage in fear, and connection in loneliness. One evening, as she was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, her grandchildren playing at her feet, she felt a sense of contentment, a sense of gratitude. The sky was ablaze with color, a breathtaking display of beauty, a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the preciousness of life. She thought about McGraw, about their journey, about the love they had shared. She smiled, a gentle, knowing smile, her eyes filled with tears of joy, of loss, of remembrance. She knew that their story wasn't over. It lived on, in the hearts of her grandchildren, in the legacy of the ranch, in the memories of Redemption Creek. It was a story of courage, of resilience, of redemption. It was a story of love, of loss, of connection. It was a story that would endure, a testament to the power of the human spirit, a promise of a brighter future. The vast mesa stretched out before her, bathed in the soft glow of twilight, a silent witness to the enduring power of love and family, a testament to the bonds that could be forged even in the face of unimaginable loss. The echoes of the past had faded, replaced by the gentle sounds of children's laughter and the promise of a future filled with hope and happiness. The final confrontation had long since passed, leaving behind a legacy of strength, resilience, and the enduring power of the human heart. And as the stars began to appear, twinkling in the darkening sky, Belle knew that her journey, though filled with hardship and heartbreak, had ultimately led her to a place of peace, of belonging, and of unwavering love. The end.